Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you in person thanks to all of the coronavirus restrictions here in the UK. As you've heard, my name's Gavin Freeguard. I'm the Programme Director for Data and Digital Government at the Institute for Government, and I'll be talking this morning about what the coronavirus crisis tells us about how the government here in the UK uses data. Before I do that, I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to the Institute for Government, and I hope that some of the work that we've done will be of wider use and interest to all of you. So in short, the Institute for Government is the UK's leading think tank working to make government more effective. Lots of think tanks here in the UK focus on particular policy areas or have particular political viewpoints. We're strongly non-partisan, and we're much more interested in how government does what it does rather than particular policy areas. So how it makes policy, how it delivers those policies, how it uses data, how it approaches big topics such as Brexit and coronavirus and set the state up to be able to deal with that. We're just over 10 years old. We've been through quite a lot in terms of British government over the last few years, as I'm sure you can imagine. And like most think tanks, we publish lots of research and commentary. We hold lots of public events, including online. But we also provide a safe space for discussion, training and professional development for senior civil servants and senior politicians. Here in the UK, you can go from being a backbench member of Parliament with 5 members of staff to running a department with a budget of £190 billion and 80,000 people overnight. So we try to do a little bit to help there. We believe that better open data, particularly open data, matters for accountability. Those of us on the outside are able to judge the actions of government and scrutinise it, but also for government effectiveness. Better data should be helping government to improve its own performance. And a lot of our work on government data has been based on using data from government to sort of illustrate the size of the civil service. As you can see here, these are civil service staff numbers in the UK. They've continued to go up after the EU referendum, having fallen for many years. We look at things like government budgets. We've got a spending review here in the UK today, so you may see this chart doing the rounds on Twitter. Looking at how well major projects are implemented, and also looking at how transparent government is. This is showing freedom of information releases from government departments and how open they've been, and that sort of all of those pinks that you can see towards the right of the chart show that it's been getting a lot worse in recent years. One of the other things we've been doing a lot recently is looking at the sort of political landscape here in the UK. This chart shows you ministerial resignations outside of planned reshuffles from Margaret Thatcher to David Cameron. And you can see just how mad the last few years of British politics have been if we put Theresa May on that chart. And Boris Johnson as well, who you can see is sort of well ahead of the curve. Again, an illustration of the sort of political times that we've been living through even before we got to the coronavirus crisis in 2020. A lot of those reports you can find on our website. Whitehall Monitor looks at central government, Performance Tracker at Public Services, Parliamentary Monitor at Parliament. But we've done lots of other reports on everything from devolution in the UK to international civil service effectiveness. And we've also got an event series that continues called Data Bites, which is trying to illustrate good uses of data in government in an interesting quick-fire presentation format. And I think one of the striking things about how coronavirus has changed how government uses data in the UK is actually there is a lot of really interesting stuff that's been going on. A lot of good examples we can point to, lots of innovative work, which is naturally why I'm going to start with a really boring administrative data set from 10 years ago in this presentation. What are you looking at here? You are looking at a departmental organogram. This is sort of showing the key people in place in a civil service department as part of our government, how much they earn, who they report to, which team they're part of within that department. Doesn't sound like the most exciting of things given everything else that's going on, but I think it's quite an important one to illustrate just how we've got to where we've got to and what's happening next. So organograms were part of a suite of data that this man wanted government departments to publish back in 2020. This is David Cameron, our Prime Minister from 2010 to 2016. And he came to office not long after a big scandal in the UK about MPs, members of Parliament, and their expenses and things that they've been spending it on, including all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And one of his first acts in his first month as Prime Minister was to write to government departments to say, we want you to open up really important data sets that would allow people to scrutinise us. That included government organograms, also included spending on contracts over £25,000, various other bits and pieces as well. Now, this also built on sort of work of Gordon Brown, the Labour Prime Minister. David Cameron was a Conservative as part of a coalition government. So open data had been quite quite a big thing in the UK. It's definitely something that we were seen as leading on globally for some time at the start of the 2010s. So there was a huge push to open up this data, not just for accountability and scrutiny purposes, but also to help improve public services through giving the public a better sense of what was going on, what they could choose, and also through people being able to build businesses on the back of this data. So organograms was one of these data sets. We looked at whether they were actually being published as the Prime Minister had asked them to be. And you can see all of the blues show where data was published. The pink shows where we can't find any data where it hasn't been published. And you can see it's a little bit patchy in the early years, but when you get to sort of 2015, publication really falls off. So we tried to, and as you can see from the sort of September 19 column, even where things were being published, they tended to be published quite late. A number of those are now available, but they hadn't been published when they were supposed to be. So we tried to find out, well, why are people not publishing this data? Why are they not using this data? We found that there were a number of reasons for that. I think the first was that they didn't think there was political drive behind it. They had in 2010, when there was all the fanfare about open data and David Cameron was writing these letters. By the time they got to 2015, 2016, it was old news. And they thought they could probably get away without publishing it because there didn't seem to be any pressure. They couldn't see the value in publishing this data. It was seen as a tick box transparency exercise, something that they were supposed to do, so they do it for those purposes. They weren't really getting anything else from it. And as other priorities took over, because they couldn't see the value of it, they sort of stopped publishing. Now, we tried to do something to help on this. We organised a hack day back in 2017 to bring various civil servants together and actually use this data, and found that we could actually produce quite a number of useful things from it that would help people run their departments more effectively and would also help the public better understand government. And there's a table there, for instance, which shows what different grades in different departments sort of hierarchy mean. And the first time anybody had published anything like that. So, helping people to understand something that wasn't there before. It was too difficult to publish these things. This sort of pairs nicely with they couldn't see the value. Not only couldn't they see the value, it was incredibly difficult to bring all these things together. None of the data internally was joined up. There were lots of different human resources systems working within the same department. It actually took quite a lot of effort to bring all of this data together, so departments opted not to do so. And finally, there were sensitivities around personal data. Now, this is a really important point, a really important balance to get right. And we'll come back to that shortly. Actually, I think in this case, departments were using this as a bit of an excuse. There is Cabinet Office guidance on how to publish these things safely. There are protections. So it does feel like they're trying to get out of publishing using that argument. But nonetheless, it's a really important balance to get right. And the fact that people are public servants it doesn't remove the need for being careful about privacy. So what can this tell us about the pandemic? Well, these are some of the reasons that data wasn't being published or used on this very boring administrative data set. If we look at what's happened in the pandemic, we can see that a couple of those things do actually fall away. Clearly, there is political drive to use data more effectively during the pandemic. This is the biggest challenge in peacetime that our government has faced in decades, if not centuries. So there is clearly political importance to being able to get things right and therefore to get data working more effectively. And obviously, it's very, very clear what the value is to getting that right. It's actually saving people's lives. It's saving people's livelihoods. It's trying to help people return to normal as quickly as possible. So, very clear drivers there of sort of better use of data. Now, of course, a couple of those other things very much still apply as well. For all that government has done during the pandemic, it is still very difficult to join up lots of data. There are lots of legacy information technology systems across government. There's lots of different data sets, data duplication, a lack of use of standards, which make it much more difficult than it should be to bring these things together for people to be able to use it in decision-making at the centre. And of course, sensitivities around personal data are especially to the fore when we're talking about people's health records and so on. Again, we'll come back to that shortly. So as I mentioned earlier, actually, there have been some very good experiences and government has sort of got on top of its use of data in some respects. And that is actually part of a sort of longer programme of work as well. This gentleman is Oliver Dowden. He's our Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And this is his foreword to the National Data Strategy, which is currently out for consultation. It's something we've been waiting a few years for. And the idea is that it gives government a vision for and a plan to implement when it comes to getting better at using data. I just want to highlight one phrase that he used in the National Data Strategy, where he talks about the high watermark of data use set during the pandemic. And there has been a lot of good data use. We've had SAGE, our sort of scientific advice group, talking to government. We've had the new Joint Biosecurity Centre set up at the centre of government, who are using data in interesting ways that are directly informing decision-making. In SAGE's case, a lot of the minutes from those meetings are being published. In the Joint Biosecurity Centre's case, actually, we still don't know a lot of what they're doing, which is a bit of a problem. So we don't see all of what's going on, but we do know that that improved data is being stood up incredibly quickly to inform decisions at the very highest levels of British politics. Our Office for National Statistics has had a very good pandemic. Again, this is not an overnight success. It's thanks to lots of investment that they've made in recent years in terms of skills, in terms of new technology, in terms of trying to use new sources of data to shine a light on the country that we live in. So some of their work has included faster economic indicators, which gives us a sense of what's happening to GDP well in advance of the official traditional publications. They've rolled out a massive coronavirus infection survey to understand the spread of the virus in the population. And they've been having statisticians at the heart of the government machine, supporting politicians to make better decisions with data. The regulatory arm of the UK Statistics Authority, the Office for Statistics Regulation, again, seemed to have had a very good pandemic. It has been intervening in public debates. It has been telling politicians that if they're using numbers, the workings behind those need to be published. They need to be much more open about the statistics they're using, and has told them off on a number of occasions where they have got things wrong. So there was a bit of a scandal with testing data. Our government had set a target for a certain number of tests to be conducted. The OSR was sort of quite critical of what they were doing there. Our government digital service is one of many parts of government that's been standing up brand new digital public services, which has obviously relied quite a lot on the better use of data. The example we've got here is the Extremely Vulnerable People Service, which allowed people who were having to shield because of the pandemic to get priority in supermarket delivery and various other things. For instance, again, required a lot of data sharing across departments, and something that they were able to build incredibly quickly. There is also, of course, the National Health Service. And again, lots of use of data. We've got a quote there from our most recent performance tracker report that sort of says, general practice, our sort of doctors had long not shared data about patients. But during the pandemic, of course, all the GP practices in a particular city suddenly are able to share data, get a much better sense of individual patients. So we've seen some sort of acceleration around all of that. And we've also got a few new bodies that have sprung up. And again, this is part of the National Data Strategy, not just about coronavirus. The Data Standards Authority, which is trying to improve data standards across governments. They're much more interoperable and you can do a lot more data sharing. And again, another part of the Office for National Statistics, which is the Data Quality Hub, which is trying to improve data quality across governments. These are all really positive initiatives, some of which have been accelerated by coronavirus. And many of which will continue in some form afterwards. Of course, it's not all positive. Many in the outside world have scoffed at the high watermark point of Oliver Dowden, because there have been a lot of criticisms about government data. First of all, local councils have found it incredibly difficult to get hold of the data they need. There are local lockdowns, or there have been local lockdowns in the UK. Local decision makers need to be able to make decisions. They've not had the data that they needed. I think that's part of broader criticism of a lot of the data not being opened up, or the formats that data is available in suddenly changing during the pandemic. Now, some of that's inevitable as government looks to improve the data it's got, but we've seen some really innovative use of data from civil society, for instance, building postcode checkers. You can understand what sort of restrictions are in place in a particular area. So you do need to make things as easy for them as possible. Formats internally have been an issue as well. There was a story a few months back where thousands of positive test results were lost because of some problems with Microsoft Excel and using an old format of that as it was being sent across government. And of course, all of the things that apply on the outside in terms of data quality and formats are also a problem on the inside. People inside government will be struggling with exactly the same things. There's been a lot of criticism about the presentation of data. This is a slide from a really key government press conference shortly before our second national lockdown in England. The communication was frankly lacking. 16 data-heavy slides in 12 minutes. people not being able to see the slides properly. All of these are real problems when it was a really important moment to communicate properly with the public. There have also been different numbers on deaths, which haven't really been explained. The government's been fudging figures around testing targets. And I think we have to appreciate the government does face a difficulty here. People are seeking certainty in numbers, which simply isn't there because of the way these things are collected and the fact that it's always a bit more complicated. I think one of the biggest things has been how open government is about its use of personal data. Now, government starts in a good place on this. This is a survey, a poll from a few years ago, where people were asked who they would trust to use personal data about them ethically. And if we highlight the sort of health authorities and government, you can actually see they're towards the top of that ranking. And if government does want to make more innovative use of data and technology, it really needs to bring the public with it. However, we've seen quite a lot of stories, sort of sharing of test and trace data with the police, the test and trace system not going through basic legally required transparency checks. And there was quite a big scandal here in the UK as well about how exam results were awarded for sort of high school students using an algorithm, which meant that a lot of people lost out. All of these things are sort of emblematic, or a lot of these things, particularly the contact tracing app and the A-level algorithm, are emblematic of a particular approach that we saw at the centre of government. This gentleman is Dominic Cummings, who until a couple of weeks ago was the Prime Minister's chief advisor. He has now left Downing Street. He has left government. And he brought into the centre of government a real sort of enthusiasm for data and for technology. I think one of the problems has been that that particular view is what we would call tech solutionism or data solutionism, the idea that you can wave a magic wand using some technology or some data scientists and suddenly all the other problems will fall away. That's simply not how it's going to work. The things that have worked successfully when it's come to the use of data in the pandemic in the British government is looking at the problem and thinking about how data and technology can support that rather than putting technology first. And I think there has sometimes been a tendency to see data, scientific advice as sort of monolithic and not to bring in other sources of advice as well, to sort of bring in the whole picture, think about the whole system, and think about exactly what it is you're trying to achieve and how data and technology can help with that. He also had a bit of a reputation for sort of trying to sweep away regulatory barriers. And it's worth saying that for all there have been positives about data sharing being easier in government throughout all of this, it's important that some useful friction exists. It's important that people's data is used properly. Therefore, you do need the right rules and regulations in place to support that. So just in summary, if we look at how data has been used in the pandemic in the UK, well, I think existing problems, particularly when it comes to data standards, data quality, there are actually been lots of different organisations involved in all of this as well. The pandemic has definitely highlighted those. At the same time, there has been some really valuable and innovative use of data that's really come into its own. And we've sort of seen things like ONS statisticians at the centre of government, people thinking very seriously about how they use data, which could provide really firm foundations for the future. But it's clear that some serious challenges remain, including that need to be open about how government is using personal data. If all people see when they think about how their data is used by government is the app, the contact tracing app taking far too long to roll out, it's those headlines about the police using test and trace data, it's their children missing out on university places because of the A-level algorithm, they're not going to be confident in how government uses that in future. So it's really important government has those debates in public and with the public. And I hope that's been a sort of useful summary of what's been going on here in the UK when it comes to the use of data through the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. And we have some time for a question. And how big is a risk for the government to misuse personal data during the crisis? How do?
Sorry, could you begin that question again? I sort of missed the first few words there. Sorry.
Okay. Do you hear us?
I do, yes.
Kevin? Yes, you do. Okay, thank you very much. How big is the risk for the government to misuse personal data during the crisis?
I think it's a really big risk. And I think, again, there have been some really good things that government has done to try to mitigate that and try to not misuse data. when there were lots of discussions at the start about the contact tracing app that the UK government was building, there was actually a sort of 3,000 to 4,000 word blog post written by the head of our National Cybersecurity Centre trying to explain the differences in approach between the apps in the UK and globally, and trying to talk about how government was going to be using that. Now, I think that was quite an important step. 4,000 word blog post isn't necessarily the easiest way to communicate some of these issues to the public, but we have seen a few things like that, which have been good. On the other hand, there's a sort of quite a long history in the UK of people being very wary when it comes to government using their data. There was a big debate about identity cards in the early 2000s, for example, which the UK was quite, a lot of polling showed people were not particularly keen on government having that sort of information on them. There was another big project which went wrong in the early 2010s, which was called care.data. And again, that was all about the use of people's health data, very poorly communicated, not set up particularly well, and again, actually damaged public trust in how government was using their data. So I think, and again, when people think about how their data has been used during the crisis, a lot of the good things will have been quite seamless. They won't necessarily have noticed it. If they're extremely vulnerable, they will hopefully have had their priority supermarket deliveries and had access to the health services that they need. Whereas the things that have really grabbed the headlines have been where government has sort of broken the rules or not done what it should have done in advance. And I think, if we're looking for a sort of real world case of where the use of data can go wrong, I don't think we've seen one with more cut through than the exam algorithm fiasco that we had in the UK, where people's grades were being assessed according to historical results at the school that they were sitting. So a lot of students in fast improving schools or a lot of very good students in poor performing schools were severely penalised and missed out on things. I think, in a sense, that's a really good example, a really bad example of what this can mean. And if that's all that people think about when it comes to the better use of data, it's not going to make them confident in how government does that in future.